Welcome everybody. Today is Tuesday, February 18, and on Tuesdays we have Mr. Dwoskin presenting his In the Headlines lecture series. Mr. Dwoskin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Angela. Yeah, it's the 18th. I know that because next week on the 25th, that's my birthday. So, it's comes once a year and it's always on February 25th. So I know we're a week from that. Welcome everybody. We're here to talk about the events of the week and some interesting subjects. And I thought I would make this sort of theme of this talk unintended consequences. And the world seems to be full of these unintended consequences. In other words, when you plan to do something or say something, you don't really have an idea of what could be happening as a result of it. And sometimes the result is the opposite of what you wanted to achieve. And we see this in so many ways. And we're in such a state of turmoil now all around the world, certainly because of the changeover in the American administration, that sometimes we just don't know what is going to happen and how it is going to affect us. And because the world is today such a smaller place than it used to be, because it is so joined together because of the internet, because of communications in general, because of artificial intelligence, because of world trade being so easy to do compared to the olden days. The world is such a smaller place. And everybody around the world, for example, has heard about the airplane crash in Toronto. Everybody around the world, if they're interested in weather, knows that Montreal had 75 centimeters of snow in 2 days. It's a smaller place. And given the fact that communications are also not only so wide ranging, but so quick, so fast, everybody knows everything nowadays. I love to say that the amount of information on your little handheld phone is more than the whole Library of Congress in the US had accumulated up until, these times. So we are really in a different world, for better or for worse. And sometimes things happen that do have unintended consequences. I could just off the top of my head talk about a couple of things which I'm not going to elaborate on because we know all about them. But the Hamas attack on Israel in October 7, 2023, so it's 500 days ago. Did these people who did they understand or know or predict that the entire Gaza Strip would be destroyed as a result of that attack? Did they figure that some 40-something thousand people would be killed? Did they think that they might have to all move out of the Gaza Strip because Donald Trump wants to build some hotels there? These are things which I don't know if anybody thought of them, but they could have thought of them, and obviously they did not. Similarly, but it's a different example, when the day after that attack, when Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Shiite militia, started to bombard Israel with rockets, did they understand that this would end up in not only the killing of their leader, not only the destruction of their bases in southern Lebanon, but their removal from the centers of power in the whole state of Lebanon? And if they didn't know that, they should have, because the last time they tried something like this in 2006, I believe, and Israel invaded and stayed in Lebanon, they said, had we known how strong Israel's reaction would be, we never would have kidnapped the people that we kidnapped. But sure enough, they were just tempted by fate or by some calculation to go ahead and attack Israel without thinking that the consequences would be the same or worse than what they had done before. And, on the Israeli side of this, Uh, would Israel have understood that ignoring the warnings of the female soldiers who were on the border, that it would lead to such a disaster in the country? And would they figure out that by supporting Hamas in the first place, that such a tragedy would befall the country? So, these sort of unintended consequences happen all the time. And it's only takes good leadership which receives opinions from a wide range of sources and can evaluate them, that some of these bad consequences could be avoided. And I'm fearing that in the United States, because of the personality of the president, who does not want to hear different voices and who doesn't want to hear conflicting opinions, that you get yourself into a sort of a tunnel and or an echo chamber, and then all the consequences of bad decision making end up hurting the country as a whole. But before we go into that, let's talk about something that is so much on everyone's minds in Montreal. It's the weather. And certainly this winter has been an unusual one compared to the past several winters, because it's been so snowy and so cold compared to the rest of them. And I thought I would catch up a little bit on the climate change progress, and to speak a little bit about that, also with the theme of unintended consequences sneaking its way in. So if you just listen for a little bit, we'll get to that. Despite the fact that we have cold weather going on both in Europe and in North America at this present time, the movement towards warmer temperatures and global warming still continues. In fact, 2024 was not the warmest year on record. And well, so far we don't have actually all the statistics from that. We know that 2023 was the warmest year on record. Partly that corresponded to an El Nino year, which is a year when the Eastern Pacific Ocean heats up. In other words, the ocean next to Chile, the ocean next to Mexico, the temperature is warmer than normal. And of course, ocean temperature affects air temperature, and that leads to extra degree of warmth in the surrounding areas. And that's 2023 was a year of record heat. It was a year of record temperatures being broken in different places. And on average, the world temperature was 1.47 degrees Celsius higher than what they call the baseline. And the baseline is the average of temperature in the world before 1900. So, meaning before the real industrialization started taking place with the burning of fossil fuels, the burning of coal, transportation, all of that. So the pre-industrial temperatures around the world are the baseline to measure everything else against. And we actually hit a record of, like I said, 1.47 degrees Celsius warmer than the baseline. You might remember when climate change started to be talked about, when it was an issue 20, 25 years ago, they were saying that if they went over 1.25 degrees Celsius, then this would lead to disastrous consequences for the world. And we've surpassed that so quickly that they also said, well, if we go over 1.5 degrees, 1.5, it will also be disastrous. And well, last year was 1.47, so it's pretty darn close. And of course, things don't change from one day to the next. So if we go over that 1.5 degrees on one day or 2 days, it's not going to make any difference whatsoever. But all of this is kind of long-term forecasting and long-term trends. And the Paris Accords, which was a worldwide agreement that was signed by all the leading nations of the world, that's where they pledged to lower their greenhouse gas output so that the world would remain under 1.5 degrees above the baseline. Surely we're going to break that. Surely there's no countries, just about, that have met their pledges of reducing greenhouse gases to 30% below what their peak was. You know, everyone's got different reasons and situations and everything like that. But the combined effects of population growth, of transportation growth, of the world's getting richer, and so more people can afford to travel, more people can afford cars, more people can afford plane rides. The increase in global trade, which means that there are more ships and cargo planes flying around, more people in the world, meaning that everyone is breathing in and out. They're eating more meat because they're richer, and meat means more animals in the world, more animals breathing, more animals causing other carbon dioxide by burping and all kinds of things like that. The circular effect, the circular effect of global warming, meaning that melting glaciers in the Arctic, in the Antarctic, in Europe, reflect less sunlight back into the atmosphere. And so the world absorbs more sun, and then that more sun melts even more glaciers, and there's even more bare rock to be seen, and you know the process continues. So you might say, you know, going back to our theme of unintended consequences, that the global warming causing the Greenland ice sheet to melt exposes more and more bare rock and bare soil in Greenland, which of course invites more geologists to come take a look, see what's there. And sure enough, they found all kinds of rare earths in Greenland, meaning these materials or minerals which are used in all kinds of electronic applications and manufactures, which are, these earths are rare, that's why they call them rare. And at this point, China is the one who controls the vast majority, in some cases all, of the production of these rare minerals. And the rest of the world, especially the US, is anxious not to allow China to have that monopoly or lock on these rare earth materials, because they can sort of cut off supply anytime they want. So that's why all of a sudden, I mean, among other reasons, of course, that the US is interested in Greenland, because they are a new source of these very rare materials that the world wants. And of course, the US would love to be able to hold on to it and to say, okay, it's ours now. So it's an indirect consequence, a very indirect consequence of global warming, that Greenland is becoming much more on the map. They've also, you know, opened up an airport in Greenland, a new one. They've opened up tourism, all because global warming makes it a little less inhospitable for people to go and visit. The colder temperatures of this year are partly due to the fact that there is no El Nino this year. El Nino in the olden days used to come once every 7 years. And sometimes now it seems to be coming more often, but this is definitely not an El Nino year. So therefore, the temperatures in the Pacific Ocean on the east side are not more elevated than normal. And therefore, you know, there's no reason for it to be warmer than normal in North America. Now, in the past, the cooling, or the big cold snaps that we have had in North America, like the one we have now, for example, could be partially explained by global warming, contradictory as it may sound. And that's because a large body of warm air comes over the top of the world, over the Arctic Circle from Asia, and it pushes the polar winds, which usually circle around the Arctic Circle. It pushes the polar winds and the polar jet stream down south in North America. So what that means is that it's extra warm around the Arctic Circle on the Asia or Europe side, and therefore extra cold in North America. This particular cold snap doesn't come from that because Europe is also cold at this time. It's also having a cold winter. But that it goes to show how the vagary of weather is something that is never explained or predicted 100%. Let's see. Yes, so we talked about temperature rise. Sea level rise, of course, is due to temperature rise, and most of the world is covered by the oceans. And the ocean water, the volume of water in the ocean goes up because of two things. One is the melting of all those glaciers that I mentioned before, melting of Antarctic ice caps, the melting of the Arctic ice caps, and all of that water that was once held frozen, solid, and stable is now being released into the oceans, which obviously push up the sea level. But an even more important reason is that the temperature of the water in the sea level is going up at a very quick rate. And warm water takes up more space than cold water. So if you, for example, filled a glass of water right up to the very brim, and then you heated that water, the water would spill over the top because heated water takes up more space than cold water. And similarly, the ocean, if you heat it up, therefore it has to expand, and therefore the sea level has to rise. On the subject of temperatures, I was reading something really interesting recently, and that was talking about the world's hottest temperatures ever recorded. And according to the scientists, the world's hottest temperature ever recorded was in Death Valley, California, which some of you may have heard about or seen, where the temperature was something like, let me try and have a look at here, 134 degrees Celsius. Yeah, 134 degrees Celsius, which was the hottest actually recorded temperature by a scientific instrument. But these temperatures are recorded at an elevation of 1.5 meters, meaning it's the air temperature recorded in the shade, has to be under some sort of canopy, and that is what is counted as an official air temperature. But the new satellites that they have going around the world now are so precise that they could record the temperature on the ground in a surface area of 1 meter squared, meaning that they, even though they're way up in space, they could zero in on a space the size of a small little carpet and say what is the temperature on the ground at that time. And it varies hugely from the air temperature that I just mentioned before. So I was reading that the highest temperature ever recorded on the ground was on the Mexican-US border, and it was 80.8 degrees Celsius, or 177 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is, again, just recently done. Now, if you can imagine, refugees trying to cross that very section of territory in the summer, not knowing how hot it really, really is, the feel of it on the ground. I mean, you can understand why people are dying trying to cross the border in the summertime between Mexico and the United States, because the surface temperature is so much warmer than the air temperature because of the intensity of the sun, the minerals in the earth which absorb those sunlight, et cetera, et cetera. The lack of shade and everything else. Now, for people who are also interested in variation of temperature, so this is another interesting one that I read in the same article. Now, what was the biggest change in one day in temperatures in one place? And this occurred in a crater in China, where the low of the day was minus 24 C, and the high of the day was plus 58 C. Imagine a huge, that unbelievable amount of change in one single day. It's like practically unbelievable how much the temperature could change in a single day. And this comes from the same ground measuring satellite temperatures that I was mentioning before. I was also reading an article about how the global change in temperatures will affect different cities differently. So that in general, the effects of global warming are felt more in the north than in the south. So we all know that, and that means that Canada as a whole is warming up, say, faster than the United States is warming up on average. So, but they did say that because of global warming and because of the effects of this global warming, that cities located in relatively northern places, like they talked about London, Moscow, Vancouver, and Seattle, that their average temperatures will be up 5 to 6 degrees Celsius by 2050. That seems unbelievable because that's really a lot. That's so high. But maybe they're right, and maybe they're not. Of course, this melting of the ice caps is going to allow shipping and is allowing shipping to pass across the Arctic, say along the Russian coast and in the Northwest Territories in the Northwest Passage. And it will allow shipping to go from, let's say, London to Japan, or from, say, Korea to New York, without passing through the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal. And I think that's another reason why President Trump is so interested in Greenland, because all of a sudden, places that ships would never think of going before, now these could be part of a shipping lane, and with all the strategic implications of that. Shipping doesn't only mean cargo shipping, but it also means, of course, military ships passing over the Arctic Ocean right through Greenland. And, this might have long-term implications in that way also. So this fact might have also piqued Mr. Trump's interest in acquiring Greenland, or for that matter, in acquiring Canada. The difference for Trump in Greenland and Canada is Greenland has 57,000 people, and acquiring Canada has 40 million people, and there's that makes a big difference right then and there. But I wanted to speak about something interesting that I read about, and this goes back to the unintended consequences part. That one of the reasons why the temperatures are increasing in the world at a faster rate than they normally would be two changes in the laws, whose intention was to make the world a cleaner place. And one of these rules was to change the amount of sulfur that's permitted in diesel fuel used by ships going across the oceans. And it used to be that they allowed diesel fuel to have up to 5% sulfur in it. So you know that diesel fuel is the most basic form of of oil that once it's cleaned, once it's purified, um, uh, the first thing that comes off of the converters is diesel fuel. It's like the bottom of the pyramid, the bottom of the oil pyramid. It's the most close to what's in the ground naturally. And sulfur is a naturally occurring substance that comes with oil and is not easy to separate from oil. So ships burn diesel fuel and have been burning it. And when that diesel fuel comes, the burnt material comes out of the smokestacks of the ships, all the sulfur is there. The sulfur itself is not burned at all. And the sulfur is in fine particles. And when these fine particles go up in the air, the sunlight hits them, and the sunlight gets reflected back into outer space or back into upper space because of this reflective power of sulfur particles. Sometimes if volcanoes emit sulfur in their eruptions, the same thing happens. Now, what's happened and what's noticeable is that the rules were changed not very long ago to require ships to have sulfur emissions less than 0.5%, not 5% like they used to be. So what that means is there's a lot less sulfur going up into the atmosphere to reflect the sunlight, which would normally come down to Earth to reflect that sunlight back up. So what it means is that the more sun is coming down to the oceans, warming up the oceans, because all that polluting sulfur is not there anymore. Of course, if you allow the sulfur, the reason why sulfur is not acceptable going into the atmosphere is that it can combine with water and energy and create sulfuric acid, which is one of the acid rain components. And then, acid rain destroys buildings and destroys, it's a pollutant. It's something that is not a good thing to have in the atmosphere. And so the elimination of sulfur from ships causes less sulfuric acid in the atmosphere, but then causes more global warming. Another source of the reduction of sulfur is the cleanup of the coal-fired generating plants in China. So coal also has sulfur bound to it. And if that sulfur, once the coal is burned, goes up into the atmosphere, it has the same effect as what I was talking about before with the ships. But China has decided, for obvious reasons, to clean up the sulfur coming out of their smokestacks so that there won't be acid rain in China eating away at buildings, eating away at bridges, eating away at anything that's acid could dissolve. And so their smokestacks are now cleaner, and therefore less sulfur is going up in the atmosphere. So there's more global warming because of it. So this is what I was referring to when I was talking about a unintended consequence of something that was made to do good, which ends up having also negative effects, that were not foreseen when these changes were made. The last thing I wanted to mention about the weather and climate we were mentioning is the U.S. has an agency called the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the NOAA. And their job is basically to look at the climate and to look at changes in the climate and to make long-term predictions and to make recommendations to mitigate any of the negative changes that might be happening. And of course, we all know that Mr. Trump and his administration are very much deniers of climate change, or ignorers of climate change, I would say better. And so they want to fire or get rid of half of the employees in that agency. But the work that they do is really vital because it can have short-term consequences in predicting, for example, hurricanes, in predicting other important changes to the climate that affect people's daily lives, that affects, for example, what farmers can grow and what they shouldn't be growing, um, uh, which affects air pollution and the bad consequences of health that air pollution have on people. Um, you know, there's so much that an agency like that does to improve the lives of people in the US that it seems shocking that he would want to just get rid of it. But, you know, they're taking an axe to all the civil service in the US, sometimes with hilarious consequences, like they fired the people in charge of looking after nuclear safety. And then it means that, if that's the case, then all kinds of unintended consequences can happen if nobody's watching over how safe are the nuclear reactors producing fuel, who's trafficking in uranium, for nefarious purposes. All kinds of bad things can happen if there's no monitoring of nuclear safety in the U.S. So these are just some of the consequences of firing people who are responsible for the things I mentioned, but there's so many other consequences as well. Now let's look at some other things that we're talking about for this week. And one of the unintended consequences of Trump's attack on Canada and the threat and the actual imposition of tariffs are that Canadians, for some reason, have decided to resist these kind of ideas and tariffs, and it's united Canada in a way that Canada hasn't felt united in a while. For those of you who watched that hockey game between the U.S. and Canada, which Canada lost, unfortunately, you saw the people in Montreal singing the national anthem with real gusto. And you're talking about Quebecers now, who are the vast majority of the audience, at that time. Even Mr. Legault, who's for sure not a big backer of the Canadian Federation, appears with other premiers and a Canadian flag, saying, we have to take steps to resist the United States. So I think one of the unintended consequences of Trump's tariffs and his bluster was to unite Canada and to deal with the problems, that we have in Canada of interprovincial trade, which there are sometimes more roadblocks to sending goods across Canada than there were roadblocks sending goods from Canada to the US. And the premiers have again, for the umpteenth time, said that they want to remove some of those barriers. And those barriers exist to protect local markets, whether it's on labeling, whether it's on permits needed to transport goods. There's all kinds of little roadblocks that have been put into place to try to protect local industries, local truckers, local businesses, and to favor those over goods coming in from other provinces. But clearly, it's time to sort of forget about those things and to try to make Canada into one market, as difficult as that may seem. Remember, it's so much easier because we're such a large country to ship goods from north to south than it is to ship goods from west to east or east to west. But changes are coming in that sphere as well. The other thing that's kind of a bit shocking is that there was a poll that was taken recently showing that if Mark Carney were the leader of the Liberal Party in Canada, that he would actually win an election. No, that he would get a greater percentage of votes in an election than the Conservatives would under Mr. Poilievre. And if the Liberals get more votes than the Conservatives, then they will win an election for sure. The other way around is not certain, because the Conservative vote is very thickly concentrated in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, in rural Manitoba, and in the interior British Columbia. And so a lot of those votes are wasted because there's so many of them in one place. And the Liberal vote is more sprinkled around evenly around the country. So shockingly enough, and this again might be because of Trump's attitudes, that the Liberals, having lost all hope before and having been abandoning the Trudeau government and cabinet, kind of in a wave, that these new polls might be giving them some hope to that they might actually win an election. Um, um, the the rhetoric of the Conservative Party against the U.S. is less strong than the rhetoric of the Liberals against the U.S. And so, this could be an explanation for what this, what this could mean. The other really notable, happening over the week is that how Europe itself is being shaken so much by Trump's abandonment, we'll call it, of NATO responsibilities, abandonment of Europe as a whole, holding talks with Putin representatives today in Saudi Arabia to sort of talk about a end of the war in Ukraine, but without the Ukraine participating. And they're the ones who are the aggrieved party in this whole issue here. And Europe is certainly not completely united, but mostly united on understanding the threat that Putin represents. And without the United States backing the Ukraine, Europe is determined to put a little more muscle into their military, putting a little more money into the pot to help Ukraine out. And this all has to do with President Trump's new nationalism, his isolationism, his support of dictators around the world, including Mr. Putin, and his abandonment of allies like the European NATO members and Canada as well. The U.S. is interested in some of the materials that the Ukraine possesses. Again, some of the rare earths that we're talking about. Many businessmen would like to end the war so that they could have access to Russia's oil, gas, and minerals. And the example that Mr. Putin showed in invading Ukraine successfully is a model for Mr. Trump to invade Greenland or Canada or Panama unilaterally as well. So it explains in a certain way how those two people, they're like birds of a feather. So they think in the same way in that sense. I think another one of these unintended boycotts, to get back to Canada again, the unintended consequences, is all that talk about Canadians boycotting the United States. And you've seen it on TV, interviews with people who say, well, we had a holiday planned in the US, and now we're going to go to Mexico instead, or we're going to go to the West Indies instead for a warm vacation. People saying they're not going to buy American goods. People saying they're not going to buy Tesla cars. Canada said they would put a 100% tariff on Tesla cars. I was just reading that Sheryl Crow is selling her Tesla car, and there have been demonstrations at Tesla dealerships saying we don't want your cars. So again, this is an unintended consequence of the radical ideas of the Trump government when it comes to putting tariffs on Canadian goods. Canadians would just react negatively to anything American, including traveling, purchasing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Booing the national anthem, we saw that at the hockey game, and you know, agreeing, Canada agreeing to take a tough line and to put counter tariffs on American goods. And if Canada does that, of course, we know the prices are going to go up of those goods that the United States ships to us. And it seems as if people are in agreement that that's a price to pay in order to not allow the US to roll over us. So I'm sure that Mr. Trump didn't think out so clearly what the consequences would be of putting tariffs on or starting a world trade war, but sort of boycotting the United States by people who could, this is, I believe, an unintended consequence to that action of putting tariffs not only on Canada and on Mexico, but in his mind to putting tariffs on Europe. Now, you might have heard his explanation saying, well, Europeans charge more tariffs on American goods than America charges on European goods. And in some cases, this is correct. But how come Mr. Trump doesn't use that logic in saying, well, wait a minute, I want to put 25% tariffs on Canadian goods coming into the US, but there is no 25% tariff on American goods going into Canada. Now, where he's right is that Canada has limits on how much goods can be imported into the Canada for items covered by the supply management system that we have. And personally, I've always been an opponent of this particular system, meaning that dairy products, eggs, chicken, other poultry, is the importation of those things is simply limited strictly by Canadian laws that say that only 5%, in the case of dairy products, 5% of Canadian consumption is allowed to be imported from anywhere in the world, which is really like next to nothing. And all of that is to protect the producers of those products in Canada who have to pay a quota for the right to produce those things. And in exchange for paying that quota, they get a guaranteed market at a guaranteed price, free from competition of imports. Clearly, this goes against free trade. Clearly, this is something that harms Canadian consumers, because if you look at the prices of these goods in the States and in Canada, you know, notwithstanding the egg crisis today going on in the States, but in general, the prices for these goods are way less in the US than they are in Canada. And we have an example in Australia and New Zealand of two countries that used to have the same system as Canada has. They abandoned that system, and they are now part of a free trade network. And yet their production of the formerly protected items hasn't gone down. It allowed those who are efficient producers to produce even more. Because under our system in Canada, producers are given a quota or a maximum of what they could produce a week or a month of, say, milk or eggs or poultry. And if they produce more, they're fined. And that's why sometimes you see pictures of, unfortunately, of milk being just dumped down the drain because, you know, the farmer had too much to produce in a certain time, and it couldn't be stored. And so he has to waste it not to overshoot his quota or her quota. So this is really, I would say, you know, a construct that is past its time, past its due date in Canada. And I think Trump is right to complain that the US can import Canadian dairy products and cheese and things, but the vice versa is not possible. So I think the Canadian leadership has to look at that. Maxime Bernier, the founder of the PPP, the People's Party of Canada, he wanted to get rid of that system, but you know, clearly he hasn't convinced the rest of Canadians of the need of that. Mr. Trump is also complaining that other countries charge GST or VAT, value added tax, on American goods sold abroad, but they don't charge it on their exports going to the United States. So clearly what this is a complete misstatement of what facts are by Mr. Trump, because a VAT is a sales tax, and that sales tax applies to things whether they're imported or not imported. Obviously, if you're exporting something, you're not selling it in the country that has the the GST, so it's not charged GST. But he forgets that in almost all the United States there is a sales tax, and that sales tax applies again to local goods and imported goods. And that sales tax could be, well, certainly, let's say here in Florida, it's 7%. So, he's claiming that VAT or GST is something that discriminates against the US, which of course it doesn't do. It's just another part of his war on to create tariffs. The unintended consequence, in a way, of Trump's attacks on the world, and certainly attacks on Canada, is to lower the value of the Canadian dollar, or to raise the value of the US dollar in world terms. Now, what that does is that it eliminates some of the effect of the tariff that he wants to put on. So, for example, let's talk about the Canadian tariff of 25% that he wants to put on as of March 1st. And of course, we don't know if he's going to do it or not, because Trump is Trump. But if he does do it, then goods coming from Canada into the US will be 25% more expensive, because he puts a 25% of tariff on the importation of those goods. Now, that tariff is paid by the importer of those goods into the US, and that tariff then has to be added into the price that the consumer pays, because the importer paid it. So it has to be passed on. Otherwise, the importer would, be out of business. However, if the threat and the actual imposition of those tariffs causes the value of the Canadian dollar to drop, like it did drop from what used to be somewhere around 74 cents American down to 69 cents. Now it's back up to 70 cents. So that percentage of drop of the Canadian currency means that the American buyer of Canadian goods is paying 5% less in US dollars than he would have normally paid. And therefore, say 20% of the tariff is eliminated, because he's forced the value of the Canadian dollar down so much that the goods are cheaper in Canada to buy. So if the tariffs go into effect and the dollar drops even more, it kind of defeats the purpose to make the goods more expensive to Americans, so that they should buy local goods, because the Canadian dollar drops so much that Americans can buy more in American dollars than they could before. Another subject, we're going to change subjects now, and then we'll get to questions and comments, is, and you might have read about this too, that the Vice President Vance visited Germany, and Germany is having elections on February 23rd, meaning next week. And he said the Germans should vote for the AfD party, which is the Alternative for Deutschland party, which is a ultra far right, racist, anti-migrant party, which no respectable other German party wants to collaborate with in a coalition government. But never mind who he recommended. I mean, just imagine any world leader showing up in the US a week before the elections and saying, we think you should vote for the Democrats, or we think you should vote for the Republicans. It's an interference in the internal affairs of a fellow friendly country, a NATO member, that is really completely unacceptable and breaks new norms, which Trump knows he loves to break, in relationships between two different countries. Nobody is supposed to go over to a friendly country and put their finger into local politics and to tell people who to vote for. It's just such a breaking of norms that goes to add on to all of the other kind of breaking of norms that Trump has done since his election. Um, um, and it may mean the unintended consequence of that is it could be that fewer people would vote for the AFD than normally would because of the recommendation of the American vice president. Although I have to say, I was checking the polls yesterday, and the AFD seemed to be doing darn well at 21% of the the vote intentions in Germany. And this is a party that has never participated in any national government because its ideas are so radical, so right wing, so rooted in the Nazi past that they are kind of considered persona non grata by all the other different political parties in Germany. And even though this party may end up in second place in the elections, the way things look now, it would be easy for the winning party, which is likely to be the Christian Democratic Party, the party of Angela Merkel, that party could make a coalition with other parties without having to take in the AFD party as a coalition partner. So there's other choices like the Social Democratic Party, which used to be the number 2 party, is now fallen down to number 3 party. And then there are the Green parties, the Free Democratic Party. There's a new party that's come up, which might make it into parliament, called the BSW party. This woman, who is a kind of a charismatic populist, decided she wants to run on her own, and has also pro-Putin views and anti-migrant views, but is not as radically fascistic as this AFD party. So she may, because of the strength of her own personality, she may make it into parliament with more than 5% of the vote. And it's possible that if the Christian Democratic Party wants a right-wing party, a right-wing government, that they could join up with her as well as all the other ones. Now let's see what else we got here. Yeah, this was an interesting one. I'll finish with this. So, of course, I mentioned Elon Musk, and I mentioned all the work he's doing to disrupt the American government. He leads a group going into offices in the American government to root out what he calls waste, or to root out civil servants who don't agree at all with Trump's philosophy of government, who are supporting DEI, who are supporting minority rights in governments, who are supporting, promoting people who are not white to top jobs in the government, and in general like I was saying before, to get rid of government agencies that deal with climate change, and who deal with foreign aid to other countries, because Trump sees foreign aid as being a waste of money. And so Musk has had this big job really burrowing into what used to be exclusive jurisdiction of individual agencies, to try to get people fired and to make sure that people who aren't fired agree with whatever and will do whatever Trump wants. Now, this has had a reaction in the United States against Trump. Sorry, let me see. I'm sorry. I mean, against Trump, but also against Musk, who is the owner of the Tesla company. So the question was, are people going to stop buying Teslas, not because of what the car represents, which is an electric car, which is an environmentally conscious and safe car, but just because the owner of that company is Mr. Musk. So how do you kind of try to figure out if this is true? In other words, will people boycott or are people boycotting Teslas for political reasons? So what they did was they said, okay, let's have a look at Tesla sales or intended sales in states that voted for the Democrats, and let's compare that to intended sales of Teslas voted in states that vote Republican. And what they did was they asked current Tesla owners, a wide sample of current Tesla owners of would you buy another Tesla? And what they found was that in states which voted for the Democrats, the percentage of people who said that we would buy another Tesla fell from 72% to 65%. In other words, they lost 7% of current Tesla owner intentions to buy a car. But in the red states, the ones which voted for Trump, the number of people who said they'd be interested in buying a Tesla of current Tesla owners went up 1%. So instead of going down by 7% or 10% in a way, depending on how you want to measure it, it went up from, let me look at my figures over here, from 47% of current owners who were asked a year ago if they would buy a Tesla, 48% said they now would buy one a year later. And the opposing figures were 72 and 65. So clearly then, Tesla sales are being impacted by the actions of Mr. Musk in support of Mr. Trump and all his policies. Yeah, let me see now. Now, of people who said they would never buy a Tesla, I would never buy a Tesla. In other words, these are people who don't own Teslas already, but people who might consider owning one. 32% of U.S. car buyers said they would never consider a Tesla in February 2025, compared to 27% who said the same thing in February 2024. So clearly, then, the ownership of Tesla is being reflected and implicated by the actions of Mr. Musk. So these are just a few of the interesting little ideas and facts that I came across this week. And now I am going to ask Angela to find if there are people who want to add to this, people who want to ask questions, people who want some more information. The floor is yours. It's your time, to express your opinion or to ask me whatever you'd like to ask. So, well, thank you so much for tuning in. I so much appreciate it. I have to say, in a certain way, commiserate with you about the weather that's there that we don't have here. But at the same time, some of you may know that cross-country skiing is my favorite sport, and I miss it so much. So if you have a chance to go out and do it, if it's something you like doing, don't hide from the winter. Go out and enjoy it and make it yours. And you'll feel so much better, even going for a walk. Even going for a walk for 25 minutes outside is something that's just so wonderful in the wintertime. Anyway, Angela, let me know what you have, and I'm here waiting. And thanks again.
I just wanted to mention for the people listening in over Zoom, you could either raise your hand or you could type it in chat or you could put it in the Q&A section, just if you want to ask a question for Mr. Dwoskin. There's nothing yet, Mr. Dwoskin.
Okay, well, maybe people are still, their feet are so cold, they're still so frozen that they're yeah, and you know, unfortunately, these type of weather conditions do cause accidents, and I don't mean car accidents, but people slipping, people shoveling snow, God forbid, who get heart attacks, people who strain their muscles easily. That's a much more common injury because of dealing with the snow. You know, it's it's part of the cost of having a winter, and it is you know, a rare incident. But when it happens to you and you say, oh my god, my back hurts, I just finished shoveling off my walkway, you know, you feel it for a few days. But it just means you have to adapt. You have to understand what your capacities are. Instead of taking full shovels of snow, take half shovels. And you know, for me, you know, and many of you know, I'm a fitness person. For me, shoveling snow was just another fitness activity that I used to love doing.
So,
Yeah,
Mr.
yeah,
Dwoskin, there
yeah.
is a question.
Mm-hmm.
It's from Mrs. Rapp. The question is, how do you feel about Mr. Carney being prime minister, bearing in mind that he has such strong pro-Palestinian learnings?
Well, first of all, Mr. Carney, uh, let's. I'll put my answer in a few different ways. That certainly in Canada, the main job and qualifications of a prime minister are to look after the country and its economy. That's really the most important job in a certain way of any country, but certainly a country like Canada that doesn't have a huge international profile. International affairs are much less important to most citizens than national affairs. So that's just as a prelude. The second thing is that Mr. Carney was the governor not only of the Bank of Canada but the Bank of England, which is certainly, they picked him for a very prestigious job in one of the world's five biggest economies because they trusted his competence in the economic area. So he definitely does have qualifications in the economic sphere of government, which is really the most important one. Um, as far as the Palestinian issue and the Israeli Palestinian issue, as a matter of concern of the Canadian government, it doesn't rate very highly because it doesn't really affect the. It's not as if Canada is in the Middle East. It's not as if Israel or Palestine are important to Canada as a country compared to all the other countries. So we're really, although it makes news and although it's a very big concern to the Jewish community of the country, if you want to look at the whole perspective of it, it's really not all that important. And there's no question that there is overall, and because of Mr. Trump, I would say particularly, there is a movement, in a sense, away from the sympathy with the Palestinians toward a more clear understanding of Israel. And the reason I'm saying that has to do in part with the release of the hostages who are able to tell the stories of their capture, to tell the stories of their suffering, to humanize this whole, um, the whole episode. Whereas before people got to speak to these hostages and they were all held as prisoners, people kind of forgot that they were actual people being held against their will in Gaza. Then the radicalization of the Palestinian movement in around the rest of the world, the crimes that are committed and work being committed by backers of these people, including just yesterday, an attack on an arms manufacturing plant in England owned by an Israeli company. The excesses of the pro-Palestinian demonstrators on campuses in the United States and Canada, causing great upset by people who are not their supporters, burning of American flags, calling for the destruction of the state of Israel. These things go way beyond the ideas of free speech and of siding with the underdog. And so any sympathies that the kind of majority of uneducated and uninvolved people might have had with the Palestinian cause, those sympathies have gone strongly downhill in lots of different studies that have been measuring these sort of things. So yes, there's always going to be the radicals. There's always going to be the Jeremy Corbyns of Canada, of the U.S., of Europe. There's always people who are, of course, Palestinians themselves, or other Arabs and Muslims who are living in Western countries who are still radicalized or become radicalized. And these radical people can cause attacks, like we just had 2 of them in Germany just now. And so these are things that security has to look after. But I believe, and I could be wrong, but I do believe that under the influence of Mr. Trump, for sure in the US, any kind of what was the sort of encampments and strikes and boycotts and attacks on Jewish institutions, on Jews themselves, the boycotting of Israel and of Jews on university campuses, all of these things will be very quickly shut down and are being shut down. And you might have heard some CJEP spokesman, I think it was yesterday, I saw her saying that, the Minister of Education of Quebec is being hard on them and is not allowing them to express, their viewpoints in classrooms and things like that. And the Minister of Education was responding to a complaint saying that, in a class on mathematics, the mathematics teacher was telling his students to read about the history of Palestine. So, like I'm saying, that I believe that if you look at things from a perspective, like from far, I think the pro-Palestinians have had their day, and that the world is ready to move on to other issues and other things. And I think that the Palestinians have a lot more to worry about with Trump being president, talking about clearing 2 million people out of Palestine to build, hotels. That this should be their focus, and not on what goes on in University of Manitoba or University of Ottawa or McGill or Concordia or this type of thing. So I don't, the answer is, to me, whatever thoughts Mr. Carney has on the Palestinian-Israeli issue are in general not that important to Canada as a whole. That would be a summary of my thought about that question. But it's a good one, of course. And people change their minds also. If they're not hardwired to a certain thing, as society changes, people's minds change, both in a certain sense being more pro-Israel in a way, or being more anti-Israel in a way, depending on what happens in the Middle East. People's attitudes do evolve. And I do believe, and this is a belief that I have looking at the medium term, that Mr. Netanyahu is not long in office in Israel. Elections have to be called within the next less than 2 years. The polls are showing him being defeated in an enormous way. The people in Israel are extremely fed up with him. And if a more moderate leader takes hold in Israel, I think world opinion of Israel and the whole Palestine issue will change as well. But that's remains to be seen, but it's just my prediction.
So we do have another question from an anonymous attendee. The question is, do you think the U.S. tariffs, which will raise costs in the U.S. for consumers, rebound against Trump in the midterms in 2028? And then then the person says Trump won because of inflation, which was worldwide because of COVID and not because of Biden's policies.
So yeah, the answer to your question is I believe yes. I believe that the midterm elections will result in a defeat of the Republicans in the House of Representatives, which they only have really an effective majority of 2 seats right now out of 436. Um, and it's normal that in midterm elections that the opposition party usually wins more votes than they had in the original election that elected the president. So that's a normal thing that happens. And I think that with Mr. Trump and all of the damage that he will cause to the American economy, especially with regards to inflation, that I think that people will punish him by electing the Democrats to a majority in the House of Representatives. Not in the Senate, because the Senate, they have a 6-seat majority. So even if they lose a couple of seats, it's not going to change over the control. But the House, they definitely, I'd say there's a 3 and 4 chance, sorry, that they will lose control of that. Effectively, what that means is that legislation that he may want would be difficult for him to pass. But as you can see, he's doing so much without legislation by passing executive orders that, and these executive orders may or may not be legal. And all of this is coming to a head in the Supreme Court. But remember, he appointed 3 Supreme Court justices, and there are another 2 of them who are super conservative before Trump's appointees. So he has a 5, or actually a 6-3 sort of a head start in the opinions of Supreme Court justices for conservative causes. So I definitely believe, and all the economists are saying, that if you put tariffs on something, it's going to raise the prices of those items. It's possible that the seller of those items could reduce their prices in order to try to stay competitive, but they can't reduce it by 25%. In the same way, the importers of those items can also reduce their prices to the consumer to try to make them more affordable, but they can't reduce it by 25%. So the consumers will definitely feel an uptick in prices. The proof of that is that the American bank rate, which the last setting of it, where they could have reduced the interest rate, they decided to keep it steady because they were fearing that inflation might go up. And the US has another meeting, and I think it's in March. Yes, it is in March, where they have to again rule on the interest rates in the U.S. And as the inflation rate would have moved down to 2%, the interest rate in the U.S. would also have moved down. But the last figures that the U.S. produced showed that the inflation rate was going up, and so it may continue to go up in anticipation of the tariffs. Certainly, the tariffs that were put on steel and aluminum have already caused steel prices to go up in the U.S. And I have a friend who's in that business, so he said they're already raising prices. And inflation, and I agree with you, is one of the main reasons for Trump winning the election. And if prices continue to go up, then it will make it hard for him to blame Biden for that 2 years down the road. Just for your information, you know that Americans borrow money to buy houses on a 30-year fixed rate, and that 30-year fixed rate has edged up again to close to or around 6.5%, which is a pretty high amount of interest to pay, considering that house prices and condo prices have been going up until now. So American consumers are feeling the pinch. I was reading some statistics on delinquency rates on payments of credit cards, which are really higher now than they've been in the last 3 years. So there are definitely people who are feeling stress over the economy. And I do agree with you that this will mean a changeover in the elections and midterms. Of course, the Democrats have to get their act together and pick some good spokesmen, pick some good critics of the Trump administration. And they also have to not allow the cultural issues, the issues of transgender, the issues of, like as another person mentioned, the issues of Palestine, the issues of uh, what used to be called woke issues, to allow those things to dominate the Democrats' message, because in general, Americans have rejected those things. So if they stick to bread and butter and they stick to the inflation and they stick to disorder in the American government, which surely is happening and will continue to happen, then they have a good chance of changing over the rule in the House of Representatives. Any other ideas or any other comments about this?
Not yet, Mr. Dwoskin.
Okay. Yeah, it's let me just bring you up to date with this whole idea of firing the American government. And some people will say, well, Washington is full of dead wood and there's lots of civil servants who sit at their desks and drink coffee and don't do anything and get a big salaries. And it's undoubtedly true. But the but is that 80% of the workers for the federal government don't work in Washington. So what that means is if you're firing people, you're firing people all around the whole country, which means that their economies will get affected. It also means that the federal government does have very important jobs to do, and critical ones. And it's not easy to separate out the good from the bad. So that's why there's going to be a lot of chaos. Okay.
Did you
Anyone?
did
Yeah.
you hear that they fired a bunch of nuclear employees
Yes, they did.
and then they try to get them back, but they don't want to go back?
Yes, that's right. I sort of mentioned that at the beginning. The people who oversee the nuclear uh, assets in the U.S., including nuclear weapons, including storage of nuclear materials, they all got fired, and all of a sudden, people say, "Well, wait a minute. We need people to watch over what's going on. Otherwise, who knows what could happen." And some people, when you fire them, they might have been at the point of retirement, so they don't want to come back to their jobs. There's other people who say, well, I could get a better job somewhere else. And so you can't get these people back. And there's other people who say, look, I don't know what's going to happen, but I don't want to work for the Trump government. So I'll wait for 4 years and then maybe I'll come back. So, there's a lot of different reactions on that whole business. The fact is, and maybe I'll close with this, is that the biggest amount, in my opinion, the biggest amount of waste in the US government is in the military. They are also the single biggest expense that the United States has, besides providing for health and welfare. So I haven't heard of Elon Musk going into the generals' offices and say, well, we have too many generals, let's fire some. Or we have too many aircraft carriers that are sitting around doing nothing, or that the military overpays for all kinds of equipment that they could buy much cheaper. I mean, these are all issues that have come up before, and I don't hear them talking about those and yet that's the single biggest place that the US could save money by trimming down the Defense Department. So let's wait and see what happens on that area and that score. So anyway, look, if there's nothing else, you let me know. But if there's nothing else, I want to again thank you all. And I want to again thank Angela for being so good at hosting. And I'll see you all next week.
Thank you, Mr. Dwoskin, and thank you to everyone listening over the phone and online. We shall see you guys next week on Tuesday at 2 p.m.
Right. Okay,
Thank you.
bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Okay, that's finished. Oh.